Hello and welcome to Political Capital. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, in the last week, a political milestone was passed. Jeff Radebe finally moved out of South Africa's cabinet after a quarter of a century of service. Now, he joined the cabinet when he was just 41 years old, and now he's a quarter of a century older and wiser. He's seen exciting as well as controversial times, good days and bad days. Let's take a quick look at the political life of the man himself.
Jeff Radebe, born in Cato Manor near Durban, spent his life in struggle. He spent 10 years behind bars on Robben Island for his political activities and 12 days in a successful hunger strike before he was released in 1990. He has a cabinet track record like few others in African politics. He's been a cabinet minister for 25 years and his time was ended only last week in the naming of President Cyril Ramaphosa's new cabinet. In all, he has headed 7 ministries from transport to energy. He has served 5 presidents: Mandela, Mbeki, Motlanthe, Zuma, and finally Ramaphosa. His cabinet career ended with this quote: "The day I made a vow to serve the African National Congress was the beginning of a lifelong commitment to this country, sacrificially, at times at the expense of my family."
Well, now here in the studio with me, thank you very much for coming for what we could call an exit interview, I suppose, from the cabinet. But your political life, politics first touched you when you were a toddler, age of 5, very tender age. Just tell us what happened.
Thanks, Chris, for inviting me. It was one day in October in 1958 when I was 5 years old, when my family were forcibly evicted from Cato Manor, a township outside of Durban, to KwaMashu, where I grew up. That day I still remember as if it was yesterday. But at the time I didn't know what was happening. But the real activation of my political consciousness happened when I was a high school student in KwaMashu, when our maths teacher, Miss Mkhize, fell pregnant, and the students from the University of Natal Black section used to come over weekends to teach us mathematics because I wanted to become a medical doctor. And one of those students was Steve Biko, Keith Mukwape, and Dr. Ralph Mkichima. That started my real activist to become an activist in the South African struggle.
What was the young Steve Biko? He must have been fiery in those days.
He was a firebrand, Steve Biko. He's the one who introduced us to the concept of black consciousness. In fact, I still remember when I was 18 years old, the first political meeting that we attended in Durban was a protest meeting against the banning and house arrest of Mayor Remco Bean. Later, I didn't know he served in my executive when I was elected as the chairperson of the ANC in Southern Natal region.
So do you think you would have been politicized? I mean, if it hadn't have been for your teacher getting pregnant at the time, maybe you may not have met Steve Biko. Do you think you would have been politicized anyway?
Yes, of course. They accelerated our political consciousness because already there in KwaMashu, we had friends such as Mandela, the celebrated poem, and his younger brother, Ubek, who was my classmate. We used to share a desk. Pagamambete, our ambassador in Harare, Balega Mbete, the former Speaker of Parliament. We also had our own youth organization in KwaMashu, which was called KwaMashu Youth Organization, Kwayo, which was a forerunner to the National Youth Organization now. So that spirit of activation was there. But what Steve Biko, in particular Keith Mukwape, did was to really give us the political content of what we're trying to do.
Now, you went into exile in 1977 to Maputo in Mozambique. You were just 24 years of age. And then when you went to the ANC camps in Dar es Salaam, it was your first flight, I understand, ever in your life. What was that like?
No, that happened in 1977 when I went to exile. But before that, I was an underground activist of the ANC operating in Durban and here in Johannesburg. But then came a time to leave the country. So talking about that flight, former President Jacob Zuma is the one who drove Mek Maharaj and myself to the airport. That's my first flight from Maputo to Dar es Salaam.
And terrifying.
Indeed, that was my first flight.
So fast forward, you were, many people may say, very lucky in the fact that you were in the first democratic government. Was there ever a time when you thought that you'd never see that day, the day you were being sworn in on that first day?
Definitely. During the hard times against the system of apartheid, there were moments when one felt we'll never reach that destination of uhuru, as we used to call it, especially when I was arrested in 1986. But that day, when Mandela voted, and I had the historic privilege of voting with him because he came to vote in my constituency in Durban. We took him to Ohlange, where the remains of the first president of the ANC, Dr. Langalibalele Dube, lies buried, where after voting he went there to say, Comrade President, what you started in 1912 has been achieved. All South Africans, regardless of race, color or creed, now have that democratic right to vote. So we need to cherish that moment. So that's why we need to encourage our youngsters to remember that that vote came with many sacrifices. Chris Hani, Oliver Tambo, and many unsung heroes and heroines of Australia.
So, as a leader in government, after some of the euphoria had died down, I mean, from my memory, I remember he was a man who wasn't very interested in protocol. He wasn't interested in the trappings of power. He was a man also, a lot of people don't know, you probably know better. He wasn't that keen on the press at times, as we know. What was he like in those early days?
He was very decisive, as we all know him. He wanted action, but very early in his presidency, he used to delegate a lot of responsibility to the deputy president then, Thabo Mbeki, who was working very closely with another deputy president, F.W. de Klerk. But Mandela, I think, his presidency was ushering the golden era in South Africa that happened once in a lifetime, to start a new society and to build a new country for the betterment of the people of South Africa. I think that foundation stone that he laid, I think, will live forever.
And what you sat down with on that day in 1994, I was just bringing it up to date, thinking the other day about Patricia de Lille, is in the new cabinet. A lot of people were saying, no, why should we have this person there? But you sat down with half of the National Party who were the architects of apartheid. How difficult was that?
Well, there was a background before that. During the negotiations, we decided that there has to be a government of national unity. So from our consciousness, we really realized that in order for us to build a new society, we need to reconcile and ensure that we build a government that must represent the people of South Africa. So I didn't have any problem sitting with F.W. de Klerk, pick both.
But it must have been very difficult because you were enemies just months before.
Well, the most important task at the time was to construct a new society. As you know, our blueprint at the time was the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP. So all our efforts, our energies, we focused to implement precisely the RDP.
Looking back on the RDP, the plan to uplift large numbers of people in this country out of poverty, how do you feel about it? Because you did give millions of South Africans a life and services they would never even dreamed of 40, 50 years ago, but not enough.
Well, of course, the challenges that we face are very huge. 300 years of colonial rule and 40 years of apartheid can never be wished away overnight. But I think that foundation stone of the RDP has laid that basis for us to further advance in terms of improving the quality of life. That's why that slogan of 1994, a better life for all, I think still resonates in 2019. So it behoves all of us, whether in government or not, to put your shoulder to the wheel so that we can drive this process of radical socio-economic transformation to improve the lives of ordinary South Africans.
In those days, what do you remember about Mandela and the sort of hope there was of the time? Have you got a story that can just sum it up for us?
Well, Mandela was a larger-than-life figure. He was giving us that green light to do what is best for the people of South Africa. So his presidency was ushering in that Reconstruction and Development Program and also building this new nation. If you remember, he even appointed Archbishop Tutu to chair this Reconciliation Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to start that process of healing in South Africa. So I think that was the defining era there. And of course, the adoption of the Constitution, I think, was one of the landmarks of the presidency of Nelson Mandela, when we were all there in Vereeniging, when he signed that Constitution into law. And who was next to him? Our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was at that time the chairperson of the Constitutional Assembly.
And the man we must never forget who held the microphone on the night he was released, February 1990. I mean, that's one thing. Just bring it up to date again. From your experience of Cyril Ramaphosa, do you think he's the man? I mean, my theory is that he doesn't have to make money, he doesn't have to make a name for himself. My theory is that he wants to see his name, Nelson Mandela, Cyril Ramaphosa, as the South African presidents. What do you think?
Well, he has brought a new dawn. That is why it is important for all of us to support the president, whether you are the ANC member or supporter or ordinary South African, because what he has done in the past year shows that he's very determined to root out corruption from the face of South Africa. I think the several commissions that have been established since he became the head of state indicates his resolve to ensure that wherever corruption rears its ugly head, it must be chopped. So, but also secondly, he has been driving the program of bringing investment into the South African economy. This very ambitious program of bringing more than 100 billion US dollars investment is already bearing fruit. Last year at the investment summit here in Johannesburg, not less than 390 billion rand of commitment has already been registered. So this is the man who has a mission, who needs to be supported.
And just finally, very briefly, before we go to a quick break, there is a school of thought that says, why wasn't Cyril Ramaphosa brought in as deputy in '94? Things might have been a lot different. What do you say?
So I think we can leave that to historians, but there was a choice that Mandela made, that Deputy President Thabo Mbeki must become the Deputy President of the country.
Okay, well, we're going to be discussing President Mbeki and subsequent presidents in the second half of this program. Do you hold that thought there? I'm speaking to Jeff Radebe, the long-standing minister who's just completed 25 years in the cabinet. As now we have former Minister Jeff Radebe with me in the studio. A man who's just completed 25 years in the cabinet, starting with Nelson Mandela and finishing with Cyril Ramaphosa. Just a quick one to start with. So Mbeki came straight in 5 years after Mandela. How different was his style? I mean, a lot of people used to say to me, no, he's very aloof, he's a bit of an intellectual snob. Well, what did you think of him?
I wouldn't describe former President Thabo Mbeki as aloof. I think he's the man who was interested in the detail, as a trained economist. So his main focus was on the economy. So if you remember in 1999, he was very focused in terms of economy. The GEAR program, even though it was started under Mandela, but he made sure that all of us focus on the economic matters. He is the one who started to establish economic clusters of ministers. I remember I was co-chairing the economic cluster with Alec Erwin, who was the Minister of Trade and Industry at the time, and I was at Public Enterprises. So he was a really hard taskmaster, making sure that we deliver on the program of bringing about change in South Africa in 1990 to accelerate our democracy.
There are many theories about, but how do you think he fell foul of the ANC and ended up being recalled?
Well, I think that's also a historic fact that at that time, in 2006, 2007, there was a fallout between the two big figures in the ANC, Mbeki and Zuma, and I think history shows that things went very bad during that time.
Now, speaking about Zuma, now you served in all three cabinets. We're only starting to find out now exactly what was going on all those years. When you were in cabinet, what kind of misgivings did you have?
Well, at the time, all these things that are unfolding right now never came to our attention. Because at that time, if you remember, in 2009, the main preoccupation was to develop the National Development Plan, which is a plan that has been embraced by many South Africans, the creation of the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation. So, but from time to time later in the year, in his presidency, these issues emerged. But I'm sure with the Zondo Commission, the whole picture will be able to be revealed.
Would you give evidence to the Zondo Commission?
Well, the position of the government, as that of the ANC, is that at an appropriate time, the ANC as an organization and the executive in terms of the government will present into the Zondo Commission.
Surely in that time, I mean, some of the things we're hearing about people interfering with ministries, you must have had people circling your ministries that you were in, wanting to perhaps maybe try and influence you.
No one has ever tried to influence me. Even if they did try, they will not succeed, because when I made that vow to join the ANC, it was a lifelong commitment to improve the quality of life of South Africans. I've never been involved in any shenanigans in South Africa.
What do you think about some of your colleagues who were?
Well, it's very sad that when people are given positions of responsibility, whether as ministers, MECs, whoever, or councillor or mayor, they forget that the mission is to serve the people, not to serve themselves. So that servant leadership is still required in South Africa. But active citizens are also required to hold us as public servants accountable.
What about some of your colleagues now? We're hearing about them at the Zondo Commission. I mean, I always get this feeling, why did people come so far for so little? I mean, if you wanted to be a lawbreaker, you could have just gone out and been a criminal. Why be a politician and go to prison all those years first, you know?
Well, I don't think we should prejudge people, because there is that maxim in South Africa that we need to hear the other side of the story. So let them present themselves, their side of the story. But in principle, I think it is incorrect if you are given a position of responsibility, especially in government, to be persuaded by people for ulterior motives.
During the Zuma years, where you were Minister of Justice, one of the stories that was obviously covered in the press here was the case of Nomcebo Jiba. You know, when you were, why wasn't it the National Prosecuting Authority never followed through and prosecuted them in that time?
Well, I think the commission that of a former judge of the Constitutional Court, Mohobo, has revealed everything, and I do know that Ngobo is challenging that decision. So let's allow that process to unfold.
Where other places do you think in your 25 years you look back and you think, oh, maybe you could have done better?
Well, I think the issue of focusing on the economy, I think probably we took too long to realize that we need to change gear to focus more on economic matters. But of course, creating a new society occurs in stages, as I was trying to describe, that the first phase was this reconstruction and development and nation building. But I think the triple challenge of unemployment, poverty and inequality is very stark in South Africa. I think we should have started earlier to drive this program of radical socio-economic transformation of South African society.
How much does it hurt you sometimes? I mean, even though, as you say, the Zondo Commission, it's still allegations, no one's been prosecuted yet, but both you and I could agree that millions upon millions upon millions of public money were siphoned out of the system. How much does it hurt you that that money should have gone to building houses and electricity and schools for people?
Definitely. It hurts me a great deal to hear stories how monies have been siphoned out of the coffers of the South African government, which is actually taxpayers' money, monies that would have been put into education, into health, and other services like water and sanitation that our people surely miss.
Was there ever a time in the Zuma cabinet when you thought about resigning in protest?
No, there was never a time that I wanted to resign, because I've always felt, as I've said, that my mission is to contribute to a better life for people of South Africa. So I can contribute that being part of the executive or even outside of the executive.
But it must have made you angry sometimes when
of course,
you saw things.
All of us are human beings. If you hear stories, it doesn't make you happy, but it's what it is.
I mean, I remember one of your struggle, and I won't say the name, but he was on trial with Mandela, and he told me once when a police chief was charged with taking a 500,000 bribe, and he said, what a cheapskate, selling his entire principles and his country for 500,000 rand. Have you seen that kind of thing? What do you think of that kind of thing?
Well, it's horrible, because I think our responsibilities as public figures is to serve the people of South Africa. The commitment to serve must never be dimmed or diminished or blurred by trappings of money or other benefits.
And as a minister, did you always try to live as simply as you did before, or?
Well, in 1996, when the government of national unity collapsed, my wife and I decided that it is good to have your own house. So we built our own house so that we're not dependent on government. So when that day came on Wednesday, I just went to my house, as I've always lived from 1996. I only used a state house in Cape Town, not in Gauteng.
So on the business front, we're coming to the end of this show. Something a lot of interest to our viewers. This $1 billion project in South Sudan for oil. I know when you were still minister, you were looking for investors. How do you think that's going to pan out, and how do you think the wealth is going to be unlocked?
Well, there is a deal already that has been signed between the Strategic Fuel Fund, SFF, and the Nile Corporation Company of South Sudan, where this Block B2 that has 3.2 billion barrels of crude oil has to be invested. So going forward, I will assume that both companies, state-owned companies from South Africa and from South Sudan, will develop a project plan and a financing model of how to take this project towards implementation. It's not only that one actually in South Sudan. There are actually two other projects. Is the pipeline as well as the oil refinery that must have a capability of producing at least 60,000 barrels of oil per day. So it is a huge investment that South Africa and South Sudan will be making. But what is very pleasing for me is that it's one of the few projects where two African countries decided that they need to develop these for themselves.
What's going to be the greatest difficulty with it, and what could be the benefits in the long term?
Well, we are virtually a net importer of oil as South Africa. So in the long term, that will assist us in ensuring the security of oil supply, but also to reduce the cost of fuel, which keeps on rising because we don't control the price of fuel, and the rand-dollar exchange also has an impact in it. But I believe this is a good strategic investment that South Africa has made. And I thank President Salva Kiir of South Sudan and President Mbeki for guiding us as a former minister, and Minister Ezekiel, the Minister of Petroleum in South Sudan, to bring this project where it is now, irreversible.
And just last but not least, just looking back on the 25 years, is there anything really that you think I should have done that, or anything you could have done better?
I have no regrets whatsoever, and I'm very proud of the achievements that I've made, whether I was in public works, when we started the public works program and starting the public-private partnerships, which we used to call asset procurement and operating partnership APOPs. I'm happy what I did in public enterprises when we listed Telkom in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and in New York, which makes Telkom the only state-owned company that declares the dividend to the shareholder, the South African government. The building of a new port in Ngquga, when I was a Minister of Public Enterprises, I authorized the signing of that first check of 2.8 billion rand for Transnet to commission the building of that port. The public transport system that we see today, the new airport in Durban, the King Shaka International Airport. So the story goes on, but there'll be a time to talk about those things. What I'm trying to say is that I have no regrets whatsoever. It has just been an honor to serve in the executive.
And just finally, Jeff Radebe, one day when you're completely retired and you're away, where do you see yourself in your future, distant future?
Well, that future is very distant right now. Right now I'm focusing on my role as the head of policy monitoring and evaluation of the ANC to assist in developing a proper mechanism so that we can be able to monitor effectively the implementation of the manifesto of growing South Africa together to create jobs, and more jobs.
Thank you very much, former Minister Jeff Radebe. I hope you enjoy life on the backbenches in Parliament, and thank you very much for coming through to Political Capital. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. From myself, Chris Bishop, and the team, it's good night.